Um, Good morning, good evening, good day, everybody. My name is Anindya Mukherjee, and I am your moderator today for the webinar. The title is Leveraging Suitable Non-Plastic Substitutes for a Sustainable Future, the Role of the UN Global Treaty on Plastics. We have assembled an excellent panelists group of presenters today that will present to you their viewpoints on how the UN Treaty on Plastics can potentially impact substitutes and alternatives. So here is a list of all the panelists. You will get a copy of, if you request, you will get a copy of the slides, and of course, I will read out the details of all the panelists just before they speak. Some housekeeping rules. Each presenter has about 8 minutes to present, and what we would like to do is to keep the Q&A after the presentations. Please feel free to write down your questions in the chat room. If you would like to address questions to specific speakers, feel free to mention their names next to the question. We will monitor the chat room and collate the questions or answers at the end. Again, my name is Anindya Mukherjee, and what I would like to do is, before we start off, I would like to give you a brief introduction as to who we are as GoPHA, and to tell you how we are engaging ourselves in this in the UN Global Treaty on Plastics. So first, who we are. So we are a global coalition of stakeholders with the mission to achieve sustainability and circularity using material solutions that are pollution-free. We have 3 major pillars that we act on. First is policy and advocacy. And in that area, what we do is we monitor the various policies around the world, and we are curating legislations or ideas or what's happening in that space for our members. The second pillar is systems, science, and programs. Of course, nothing happens in a vacuum, which means that the entire value chain of using materials and eventually recycling, reusing, composting, biodegradation is a systems approach. So we use science with a systems approach, and we have programs where we try and elucidate the science behind what's happening in this value chain. And last but not least is our community communication and education. So what we do is we act within a community, we share the information, we communicate, and we try and educate stakeholders and those that are interested in the science behind using sustainable and circular material solutions that are pollution-free. So we have about 65 different organizations that are part of our mission. And I do not want to read out all the names, but you can see here that it covers the entire value chain, starting from feedstock all the way to the markets. Now, what I would like to do is to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in the policy and advocacy side, because this is where I think the most important work lies for us. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to help create a favorable regulations through proactive monitoring and influencing policy. We have been engaged in the EU, for example, with the start in 2018 when the SUP directive first was launched. We have monitored that. We have tried to influence how that policy came into effect. But of course, there is still work to be done. And as part of that, we have formed various coalitions like the National Polymer Coalition to try and change some of those laws that are not favorable towards materials that are biodegradable, compostable, and bio-based. We're monitoring the PPWR. We have looked at in Asia where different SUP bans are in place, and of course also in North America, in the US, in California. We have been watching and creating position papers on AB 1201, SB 54, and others. So the UN Treaty on Plastics is a very important instrument. And while this slide has a lot of information, I do not want to go through every line, but basically would like to tell you that the opportunity here is significant. The benefits and advantages of substitutes and alternatives has really the ability to genuinely turn off the tap on fossil plastics. But there are challenges. The challenges include the lack of information and knowledge on suitable alternatives and substitutes. There's really a lot of infrastructure that is needed and capabilities that is needed to transition is still very much lacking, and a lot needs to be done. Then there is the danger of greenwashing that we see every day. Folks are engaged in trying to pass on items that are not sustainable as sustainable. And of course, plastics or plastic substitutes are not pure materials. There are additives added, and some of these can be harmful, and those need to be monitored. But the impact of a balanced treaty is enormous. First of all, we believe that the treaty, if we have a balanced treaty, that it would be translated into legislations throughout the world in many countries. They are really watching and they are participating in this. We also believe that a lot of research and development that needs to go into alternatives and substitutes to replace fossil plastics. We don't use fossil plastics. It's a very substantial volume that is used. By last count, it exceeded 400 million tons a year. So to replace that was not going to be easy. And last but not least, a lot of investment and the growth of sustainable alternatives and substitutes are needed. So what is a substitute? We prepared a list of items, what we think are, should be used to judge what are substitutes. And of course, what are suitable substitutes are not. That is also very important. So there are four real important points as to what makes a substitute. Number one is natural and renewable carbon, no fossil carbon. Compatibility with circularity and design, reusable, recyclable, compostable. Biodegradable in the event that something is leaked to the environment. And last but not least, that it does not persist in nature, as in microplastics free. And of course, substitutes does not mean that it gives people a license to litter. It is not a substitute for proper waste management and, of course, standards and regulations. And we also should be focused on reuse and redesign, because we believe that there's a lot of superfluous products out there today that we could live without. So I will stop at that point, at this stage here, and go over to the panelists. There was one or two other slides that I wanted to show you in terms of how circularity looks like that should be also a part of substitutes. So our first speaker today is Dr. Enrique Pacini. He is an economist and program manager at the UNCTAD in Geneva, working on applied trade and circular economies. You have a full bio over here, which I will let you read when you receive the slides. And with that, I would like to hand over the presentation to Enrique Pacini.
Thank you, Anindya. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you from Dhaka, Bangladesh, where I am now. I have a set of slides, if the team could put on the screen.
Absolutely.
Where I could share them.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure whether you wanted to share it, but I can share it as well. Shall I share it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, I mean, most UN agencies are now involved in the UN plastics treaty process. Perhaps the biggest negotiation that is ongoing right now in terms of multilateral environmental agreements. And we have been working on this theme of plastic substitutes and to a certain extent plastic alternatives for a while now to try to identify options that could more sustainably replace plastics in some functions, just like Anidia mentioned, with a better environmental footprint, ideally with also the positive social footprint. Can go to the next slide. So trading plastics, and plastics are very large. I don't want to repeat what has already been said. Over 300 million tons of plastics are traded. Plastics are one of the most traded products in the world, both in its elementary parts like pellets, but also as intermediary products and in products traded. It amounts to around $1.2 trillion in value. Only a small fraction of that is plastic scrap. Recycling, as all of you know, is insufficient or inexistent in many places and countries. So we need to find options that even in a less governed or a weakly governed environment can contribute to a lower environmental pollution, especially lower persistent environmental pollution. Next slide. For that purpose, we try to organize thoughts in a way separating two clusters of materials. So what we call plastic substitutes, which are non-plastics of mineral, plant, and marine or animal origin, and plastic alternatives, the so-called better plastics. Of course, this is highly debatable, but they would be either disconnected from the fossil fuel system, so bio-based, or have a better footprint at the end of life, such as degrading back into elementary components such as CO2 and water. Next slide. Both plastic alternatives and plastic substitutes are already mentioned in the ongoing negotiations towards a global treaty against plastic pollution. So plastic alternatives are mentioned. And what is interesting here is that the sustainability criteria suggested for plastic alternatives, for example, bio-based plastics like PLA, involve a very similar wording as for plastic substitutes. So they should be safe, environmentally sound, and sustainable. That line it seems to be a convergence line between both clusters of materials that can help to replace conventional fossil-based plastics. So we should keep always that in mind. Next slide. We try to have a quick crack at quantifying the global trade in plastic alternatives, and pay attention to this word alternative. This is it's a blurry definition, right? Plastic substitutes also include derivations of cellulose, and actually the theme of this call today, PHA, is within the cellulose derivatives chapter, the 39139. So the third one down there. So they are products that fit optically in one cluster, but they actually could also fit to the other. But the important thing is their environmental footprint, and of course a market uptake, which should be ideally better than the conventional plastics. So trade in plastic alternatives is very small compared to trade in conventional plastics. Around 1% of the trade, or less than 1% of the trade of plastics as a whole. Plastic substitutes are more traded. They are around 1/3 of the global equivalent of the global plastics market. Substitutes, I mean glass, clay, paper, and other well-established materials in the market. But you can see that this is still potentially plastic alternative is potentially an exponential in the early stages. The markets are still small, but again, solar was also a small market 20 years ago, and now we know where it stands. Next slide. Yeah, this is just to show that the the wording on sustainability for non-plastic alternatives and substitutes is very similar. Those are excerpts from the latest versions of the negotiation texts for the INC, and also the WTO dialogue on plastics, which includes a slightly different definition for sustainability for substitutes, mentioning then that they should be environmentally sound, safe, and effective. Different word here is effective, effective in replacing plastics that we want to reduce in the market. Anidia, could you return to the previous slides just briefly? Yes. One important thing that we noticed when we were looking at this data is the second graph here to the right. While the value more or less continued, there was a kind of convergence between the value and the volume of plastic alternatives closer to 2021, and I think we believe this is getting further. There are further dynamics in this market. What does this mean? There is a tendency for the cost per kilogram. So the dollars per kilogram or per ton of these materials to fall through time, which is potentially encouraging, given that only substitutes, so non-plastic materials, probably cannot replace all the plastics in the market, and never will. But these, some of those alternatives, especially the ones that fully biodegrade with lesser consequences to the environment, are getting gradually cheaper, which is an interesting insight from the market. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just to show that substitutes today, they constitute around $388 billion in trade, but most of it is constitutes of raw material. There's only 1/3 of it, it's value-added products like paper cups or glass bottles or cotton bags. Next slide, please. In terms of tariffs, I mean, this is one point we often mention. It's important to have cohesion at the border, right? Often, plastics, most or the majority of them, fossil fuel-based, are treated in more favorable terms when being imported compared to plastic substitutes. We could and we should update this graph to include plastic alternatives to compare. That's one of the goals for the INC-4. But it's very important that border regimes facilitate the entry of what could be potentially better and make it difficult to what could be potentially more complicated. Next slide, please. Or any material, be it a substitute, an alternative, or even a plastic, should be looked at from a life cycle analysis perspective. This is a common message from the countries and members participating in the INC, the UNEP Life Cycle Initiative, and also from our analysis. Because a substitute can be worse than a conventional plastics, depending on the parameter. But of course, we should also take into account the job creation effects of that type of material, and again, how it can be made, a product can be made better. Next slide. Yeah, we are mapping notifications related to plastic substitutes communicated by countries to the WTO to have an idea of what current sustainability regulations are being applied to substitutes today. And we notice that the impact on, we notice that there's a quick growth in notifications in the WTO concerning substitutes. I mean, plastics, we already know that there is a lot, but concerning substitutes, and it's faster than the average of the total environmental notifications. You can see in the second graph here, the gray line. So this is to say that countries are already paying heightened attention to regulation of plastic substitutes domestically. Next slide. And about to converge to the end, this is just an insight showing that most of the notifications to WTO by member countries are related to, concerning substitutes, are related to environmental sustainability and health and human health. So we should always keep in mind that human health seems to be the big driver of policy in countries. So which is fundamental to work with that for material shift. Next. Yeah, so yeah, we're preparing a number of studies on this area, looking also a bit of at the health impacts of our plastics projects that we have under technical assistance, and looking at material transition in some areas, like incorporating natural fibers in textiles to reduce a bit the dependence on substitutes that have a high pull on land, such as cotton. It will be interesting to hear from the other panelists their ideas on how to source or to put in the market and upscale the market of for example, PHA or PLA that do not really ask for more land use, because I think that will be a very important aspect of environmental performance of any material that countries and markets decide to adopt. I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Enrique. Okay, we move to our next speaker, Mahesh Sugatan. Mahesh is a senior policy advisor at the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, in short, TESS, Geneva Graduate Institute, and an independent trade and sustainability expert. Take it away, Mahesh.
Thank you very much, Anandya, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the world. So I would basically, in my presentation, I would like to give a bit of an overview of what are some of the key trade-related policies and processes that can affect the deployment and scale-up of non-plastic substitutes. Next slide, please. So in this slide, basically, I'd like to provide an overview of some of the main trade-related processes which are relevant to scale-up and diffusion of environmentally safe, sound, and effective non-plastic substitutes. Now, we already, Anindya, as well as Henrique, had touched upon the issue of definitions. And while there is no universally accepted definition of non-plastic substitutes and plastic alternatives, I think it would also be important to point out that there are a lot of references. For example, in the WTO ministerial statement of the dialogue on plastic pollution, there is a reference to environmentally safe, sound, and effective. So I believe that actually would touch upon a lot of the criteria, for example, that was mentioned by Anindya when he opened this presentation. We also, so what I will do today is basically touch on each of these different processes which are relevant to trade. And one thing to note is that all of these processes can inform as well as be informed by the developments in the plastics treaty negotiations. So there is a sort of a two-way synergy that can be explored between all of these processes. Next slide, please. So first, when it comes to the WTO dialogue on plastic pollution, now the DPP, as it's known, was launched in November 2020 as a member-led initiative to explore how the WTO could contribute to efforts to reduce plastic pollution and promote the transition to more environmentally sustainable trade in plastics. Amongst the key elements of the ministerial statement on plastic pollution that was issued on 21st November 2021 include intensifying work on areas of common interest to reduce plastics pollution. Now, more specifically on technical assistance and capacity building that is relevant to non-plastic substitutes. For developing countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, there is a reference in the statement where it supports efforts to expand trade in environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives to single-use plastics, encourage collaboration with the relevant stakeholders through inter alia, the exchange of knowledge and experience relating to the development of an access to environmentally sustainable and effective, including cost and functionally effective, in emphasis, substitutes and alternatives to single-use plastics. And finally, also a reference to developing and strengthening local capacities to produce environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives to single-use plastics. Next slide, please. Now, what have been some of the key developments that we've seen in the WTO dialogue? Now, one of the three work streams that was created by the DPP is on promoting trade to tackle plastic pollution. And this includes trade in environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives, as well as technologies for environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives of interest to developing members and least developed countries, including SIDS, small island developing states, as well as opportunities for the MSMEs, or small and medium enterprises in these countries. Now, over 2022 to 3, WTO members and stakeholders have shared trade-related plastic policies and approaches to promote environmentally sustainable, safe, and effective alternative plastics and non-plastic substitutes. Some examples of these trade-related policy measures, or TRPMs, as the acronym as is commonly used in the WTO, are illustrated in this slide. And these, for example, as you can see, include technical regulations or specifications, related conformity assessment procedures around compostability or biodegradability, exemption of substitutes and alternatives from import bans and prohibitions which apply to conventional polymers, and support measures such as grants, preferences in public procurement, tax concessions, and non-monetary support such as for research and development. Next slide, please. Now, the WTO Secretariat has also compiled the results of a survey of dialogue members, noting where non-plastic substitutes have been identified in trade-related plastic measures or discussed in the dialogue. The results are included as factual compilations which have been attached to the WTO DPP ministerial statement that was issued at the 13th ministerial conference that recently took place in Abu Dhabi in February. Some of the main non-plastic substitutes, alternative plastics, and ancillary services noted are illustrated in the slides. In this regard, I'd also like to emphasize that when we speak about plastic substitutes, and India had also mentioned this whole ecosystem, I think, that is needed for the deployment. And in this ecosystem, services also play a key role. So, for example, waste management services that might be relevant to some of these plastic substitutes, and other services like R&D or collection services, sorting services, etc. Another point that is also important to discuss is that to promote the scale-up and non-plastic substitutes, we also have to look at the question of technology as well, and technologies would come into both the goods part as well as the services part. Next slide, please. Now, what happened at the WTO Ministerial Conference that took place recently? Now, DPP Ministerial Statement at MC13 identified the importance of international cooperation on various actions, including on a voluntary basis, individually and collectively, including, among others, on promoting cooperation on trade that contributes to ending plastic pollution, including trade in environmentally sound, safe, and effective non-plastic substitutes, taking into account scientific evidence and knowledge, and environmentally sound, safe, and effective plastic alternatives. Now, this opens up a number of possibilities for trade-related actions and cooperation among the DPP members at the WTO to promote some of these non-plastic substitutes. As the DPP does not have a formal negotiating mandate, unlike a lot of the other bodies in the WTO, what could be done is basically looking at some examples of aiming at some outcomes around non-plastic substitutes that involve voluntary initiatives, voluntary pledges, etc. So, for example, there could be voluntary pledges to provide preference to environmentally sound, safe, and effective non-plastic substitutes in government procurement measures, for example, that countries might take. There could be pledges, for example, to eliminate import duties on a select list of environmentally sound and safe non-plastic substitutes and materials and products made out of such materials by MC14, which is the next WTO Ministerial Conference. WTO members could also consider aid for trade-related measures related to building production and export capacities for some of these non-plastic substitutes in developing countries, least developed countries, and small island developing states. And finally, there could also be voluntary action to introduce particular national tariff lines for selected non-plastic substitutes to improve transparency, alongside ongoing support for discussions on harmonized system reforms at the 6-digit level. Now, this whole issue of harmonized system reform and creation of national tariff lines relate to the issue of promoting transparency on these substitutes. How do we know which substitutes are being traded? What are the volumes that are being traded? And how can customs officials better identify these substitutes when they cross borders? Next slide, please. Now, in terms of promoting trade in environmentally sound and safe non-plastic substitutes, there's bilateral and regional trade initiatives can also play a major role. So, for example, these initiatives could look at lowering or eliminating tariffs and non-tariff measures on non-plastic substitutes and plastic alternatives, promoting trade in specific non-plastic substitutes between developing countries, including, for example, through the UNCTAD's initiative of Global System of Trade Preferences, where developing countries extend preference to each other on a select range of products, providing procurement-related preferences to non-plastic substitutes from trading partners in the RTAs or bilateral agreements, promoting trade in services, including waste management or recycling associated with non-plastic substitutes, as well as reuse and refill models that involve the use of non-plastic substitutes. And finally, initiatives on mutual recognition of standards and conformity assessment procedures on some of these non-plastic substitutes. Next slide, please. Now, the other big trade-related process that is going on is at the World Customs Organization, where customs officials have been discussing the possibility of HS, reforming the HS system, and clarifying some of the HS definitions around a lot of products, including plastics as well as non-plastic substitutes. Now, while certain alternative plastics, such as that was mentioned by Henrique, such as polylactic acid, have their own HS codes, for many non-plastic substitutes, there is no distinct HS subheading at the 6-digit level. Now, the 6-digit level HS subheading is the globally harmonized common customs code that is used by trade officials worldwide. Now, if you look at some examples, so if you have, say, containers which are made from banana leaves or areca leaves, there is no specific HS 6-digit code that pertains to some of these products. The closest match would be a subdigit, HS subdigit code, which includes a broad range of products. So, for example, the banana leaves containers could be classified under HS 1401.90, which is other vegetable materials of a kind primarily used for plating. For example, bamboos, rattans, reeds, rushes, raffia, etc. So you see there's this big broad subheading. So there might be a case for specifying or subdividing some of those non-plastic substitutes which are made from specific materials and creating their own HS 6-digit codes. Now, in the case of PHA, now this is something where the input that we've got from the WCO is that it could be potentially classified under HS 3913.90, which are other natural polymers. But from a survey of literature, we also find that there's been examples of customs classification under HS 390799, which are polyacetals and other resins. So this is something that may be looked at in further detail as to how what would be the classification that would be followed, and whether this classification would also depend a bit on what kind of feedstocks are used for PHA, what is the end impact, the environmental impact of the material. And the key consideration is that for customs officials, what really matters is the physical characteristics of the final product. So if two products are made from completely different processes, but they are physically identical in all respects, and perhaps a differentiation can only be made on the basis of, say, laboratory testing or chemical testing, that might create some challenges in terms of creating their own HS 6-digit code, because customs officials need to be able to easily identify these products when they cross the borders. So the key thing to note is that WCO HS reforms can help improve the transparency, but the process will be time consuming. Next slide, please. I'll quickly wrap up now. So the other big initiative that is trade-related initiative is the need for standardization initiatives, and there are a number of illustrative examples. There might be some gaps in standards coverage that pertain to non-plastic substitutes. And the term standards is also often rather used loosely, and it can include voluntary multi-stakeholder standards set by ISO, regional and national standards, but they can also include voluntary stakeholder initiatives. Next slide, please. And that's the final slide. So in this slide, I'd just like to touch upon what does this mean for a global plastics treaty? And in one particular thing I would like to highlight is the need for financing. So developing countries have highlighted a number of priority areas and needs on financing, and they have specifically mentioned the development of new substitutes. They have also mentioned research, development, innovation, and they have mentioned industry transformation and transition through a dedicated financial mechanism. And this is something that stakeholders could potentially take up at the INC to say, well, if there are some potential promising non-plastic substitutes, what is the whole range? What kind of financing that would we need across the life cycle, across the value chain for fully deploying these non-plastic substitutes and scaling them up? And what can be done to make that happen? And that would include not just public funding, it would also include promoting private sector investment in these sectors. And finally, of course, as Henrique and Anindya mentioned, we should not mention that policymakers will always take into account a range of considerations, including life cycle criteria for environmental impacts, the health impacts, as well as export opportunities and economic development opportunities. So this also needs to be kept in mind in terms of policies and strategies to promote these non-plastic substitutes. So with that, I'd like to end now. And sorry for being a bit over time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mahesh. And our next speaker is Dr. Erwin Lapodra. He is a business manager, biopolymers at Kaneka and responsible for expanding the use of bio-based and biodegradable PHPH, which is a PHA material, towards a variety of new applications. Erwin, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank GoPHA for organizing this webinar and giving Kaneka the opportunity to explain the commercial readiness of PHAs. Next slide, please. I think very shortly, who is Kaneka? Kaneka is a technology-driven solution provider active in 4 strategic domains: materials, quality of life, healthcare, and nutrition. And within this scope, we have at this stage 9 business lines, going from conventional polymers, plastics, to specialty plastics and additives. We have foamed plastics in our group. We have materials for electronics, for solar cells. We have fibers in the group. And then we have as well medical materials and pharmaceuticals and food materials in the group. Our headquarters is in Tokyo, Osaka, but we have about 104 subsidiaries worldwide and are organized into regional holdings, one in Europe, Asia, and Americas. Myself, I'm belonging to Kaneka Belgium, who is part of the Kaneka Europe holding. Seeing this overview of business lines, you probably question already what is now the key competence of Kaneka and how correlates that to PHA. Next slide, please. So basically, Kaneka has 2 key technologies. One technology is fermentation. And with fermentations, we were active in the foods, in the pharmaceutical intermediates, etc. And the other key technology is macromolecular technologies, where we are, of course, being active in plastic processing, going from base chemicals to even fibers and the foamed plastic materials. And it's basically the combining of these 2 key technologies which makes Kaneka really a strong player and which helps really the commercialization of the PHA product group. And next slide, please. As already explained, PHAs are produced by fermentation. As well, Kaneka is using the fermentation technology. We are currently using plant oils as feedstock in the fermentation step. Plant oils can be the virgin plant oil, but can as well be recycled plant oils, for example, from recycled cooking oils. The microorganisms convert these plant oils into our PHPH. And after that, we purify and we can process like a conventional type of plastics. By that, we are ending up with a polymer structure which is 100% bio-based and which has the characteristic of being biodegradable, let's say, in all environments recognized so far. So it is industrial and home compostable, but as well biodegradable in open environments such as soil and marine. Kaneka focus itself at the moment on the PHBH structure. So PHB is probably the most well-known polyhydroxyalkanoate, but microorganisms as well have the capability to produce some co-monomers of PHB, like with the hydroxyhexanoate, as well with the valerate, etc. Kaneka focused on the PHBH concept, however, can vary the co-monomer ratio, and by varying the co-monomer ratio, we are capable as well to making polymers with different mechanical properties. Next slide, please. By this, we believe that really PHA and PHBH are really attractive polymers as substitute or alternatives to conventional polymers, because basically it takes a lot of boxes which are required by the industry. For, of course, it is recyclable. It's a thermoplastic polymer, so it can be mechanically recycled. It can as well be organic recycled via compostability, but it as well biodegradable, like said before, in open environments. By this, it will as well not create any persistent microplastics. I think attractive as well is that it can be processed with the conventional equipments used in the plastic industry, and it is what we call tunable because we can achieve different mechanical properties. Next slide, please. So what is now the status of Canica in the PHAs, and where do we come from? Basically, in the 90s, our researchers were already looking for microorganisms which were capable for making polymer structures. Even in the 90s, let's say, microplastic concern was not there yet. Pollutions of the seas were not there yet. Nevertheless, Canica already looked into these opportunities. While in the 90s, several microorganisms over the whole world has been investigated, we basically found suitable microorganisms even in the soil in Takasago, the location where our current production plant is. And these microorganisms look to be suitable to produce PHBH. Nevertheless, it still took a long time to go to commercializations and to establish really an upscaling with a production process which is really solvent-free and sustainable. However, we achieved, and I think Canica was one of the first companies really capable of producing on commercial scale PHBH. So in 2011, our first pilot plant has been established, the capacity about 1,000 tons. We upscaled that pilot plant up to 5,000 tons in 2020, and now we finished end of 2023 our first production volume plants, in which we now have a capacity of 20,000 tons of PHBH. Next slide, please. However, I think Canica is looking to further really expand the production, but to expand the production, it is of course very important that we have as well these suitable applications developed. So application development will be the driver for further increasing our production capacity. It is well the intention of Canica to not stay only with production capacities in Japan, but like said before, we have regional holdings. We are intending as well to establish commercial production sites in Americas and in Europe. Next slide, please. I think with the following slide, I will demonstrate some applications which we have realized, and as well some applications which we are still working on. This slide shows some commercial applications which we achieved with brand owners in Japan. The brand owners were really looking into substitute alternatives towards the conventional plastics because they want to be ensured that if something happens unintentionally with the article, they will be at least not be persistent in nature, etc. I think important on this slide as well to see that we have we could achieve different type of mechanical properties. We go from flexible, like the bags, until the more rigid, like the spoon or the cosmetic packaging. Important as well is that with that you see that different processing technologies has been used. We have blow molding, injection molding, tube extrusion, etc. And as well, food contact applications has been realized. Next slide, please. So this is not to explain. This is the reason why brand owners are looking into this material, because it is not persistent in marine water. Next one. Of course, I think combinations with other natural polymers like cellulose are very attractive because cellulose and PHAs have, let's say, similar marine biodegradable characteristics. Next one, please. And this could lead to even more complex structures where combinations of PHBH hard capsule with lids and labels could be used to develop home compostable coffee capsules, which are at the moment not mechanically recyclable, could be recycled via organic recycling and composting. Next one, please. Of course, as said before, we have as well our fiber division. So we as well we established as well Green Planet fibers, stable fibers, monofilaments, non-wovens, etc., which is of course very big and interesting for hygienic articles, but as well like for tea bags, etc. Next one, please. There is a kind of misconception, of course, as well, that biodegradable plastics could only be used for applications with short lifetime. This is, of course, like I said, misconceptions. Our PHBH is currently used as well in reusable drinking cups in a football stadium in Belgium, where after the games, the cups are washed and reused again at the next game. Next one, please. We can skip this one, Aninja, and go to the last one. So basically, maybe one before the conclusion. So maybe I think Green Planet applications are in line with circular bioeconomy, and I think could be a good alternative to the conventional plastics because it's bio-based, recyclable, and biodegradable in open environment, and by this not seen as to creating persistent microplastics. I think I have shown that through commercial and development projects, the industry is ready with this alternative. But I think negative point is, of course, for us, there is still some lacking in regulatory framework. For example, there is not a clear definition yet on natural polymers. There are some guidelines which are conflicting. There is a lacking of good standards on what is marine biodegradability. As well, innovative recycling technologies are not supported, like organic recycling, etc. And as well, I think there is a very high focus on recycled content, while the bio-based content is not recognized. And even as well, if we use biomass from recycled oils, for example, this is not seen as well as a recycled contents. That's basically my presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erwin. Okay, and we move to our next speaker, and that is Dr. Elisa Gambuzzi. Elisa works as a junior project manager at the Technological Center for Energy and Environment in Cartagena, Spain. And welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Aninja, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop that is being very interesting. Okay.
Did you want to share?
I prefer to share my screen if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, you should see the full screen now. Do you?
You need to go to yes. Now we can see.
Okay, now you see. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll try to be quick. Basically, what I want to present is a real case where we try to build from scratch a value chain to valorize used cooking oil into B3HB. Okay, so basically, this new value chain has been built in Lazio region. And Lazio region is one of the pilot territories, you will listen to me call it lighthouse of the HOOP project. So first of all, very briefly, what the HOOP project? The HOOP project is an Horizon 2020 innovation action. We are not innovating on technologies themselves, we are innovating on the ways that territories, especially cities and regions, are implementing circular bioeconomy solutions. So you see from this slide that we have like two blocks, two pillars. One is the work that we are doing with the lighthouses. So basically, the core of this work is the project development assistance. And then there is the replication strategy. We actually count on a hub network of cities and region. We currently have 111 cities and region across Europe. We actually are getting some interest from Latin America and from India. We cannot accept them into the network, but we are happy to interact with these stakeholders that contact us and are actually, they are users of the hub. The hub is the internet infrastructure where we host all these replication action that we are creating, starting from the work that we are doing with the lighthouses. So I invite you to visit the hub. Later, I will share a QR code so you can easily scan it and check it out. So how this biopolymer took Lazio region's attention? Everything started because in Lazio region, I mean, in Italy in general, there's a good level of bio-waste separate collection. But Lazio region is really a lighthouse because they have like ridiculously good bio-waste quality and also quantity. To give you an idea, they separately collect almost 80% of the bio-waste they produce with households, and the quality is around 95–98% of purity. It means only 2–5% of the material in the bio-waste is not bio-waste. So definitely all bio-waste. What is like the first step that they were thinking to take? Produce compost. Everyone wants to produce compost, but the HOOP project is not about compost. Actually, it was born to foster the application of circular bioeconomy solutions that go beyond compost and anaerobic digestion. Even if we know that the regulatory framework in Europe nowadays make it a little bit complicated because actually anaerobic digestion and composting are quite well supported by the current European and national regulations. So the question is, okay, if we can think about compost, what can we think about? We provided them a state-of-the-art of technology for the production of safe bioproducts from bio-waste. It's a 250 long pages confidential document that I can share, and I'm sure you don't want to read it because it's really too long, but be aware that they read it and they found a technology that is actually patented by Navigate Corporation, maybe an acquaintance of some of the participants to this workshop, where you can produce by fermentation, as Mr. Lepoutre commented before, P3HB from used cooking oil. And so they considered it was very interesting because in Lazio region, there is already a cosmetic and pharmaceutical market. So in Lazio region, there is the buyer of this P3HB plastic. So what happens next? The next step was to involve the value chain stakeholder. The value chain didn't exist before the HOOP intervention in this territory. So our local partner really made an excellent job to start a conversation both with the cosmetic sector and the waste oil management companies, including the National Consortium for Used Cooking Oil Management. And so we started a long process, and what really took their attention was the market value of P3HB compared to the market value of other products that you can get from the recycling of used cooking oil, especially we think in biodiesel and other power application that have a very low value with respect to P3HB, which market price for cosmetic application, we must really highlight this, for cosmetic application is around 50 euros per kilo. So it's quite high value. We showed them that there are already products in the market. You've seen it also in the other presentation. And what also take them their attention is what Dr. Pacini mentioned before, is the safety, because P3HB is totally atoxic, it's biodegradable, and so if we can use it as functional ingredient in cosmetics, this brings many advantages with respect to the currently most used UV filter or functional ingredients that can be either toxic for human health or for the environment. We also provided a legal assessment, and we saw that it was quite easy to implement this new value chain in Italy. There was no regulatory burden. If you have more questions, you can write to this person that you can see here in the slide that was responsible of. She is actually responsible of the HOOP Legal Advisory Board. And what we presented to them was a simulation, a techno-economic feasibility study for the creation of a full-scale industrial production plant of P3HP from used cooking oil with the Italian market references. So I'm currently working on a peer-reviewed paper together with Navigate Corporation. We hope to publish it in the next week, at least to submit it in the next week, sorry. And so I hope that you can find it online relatively soon. There will be on this paper we will present results like, for example, return of investments in function of P3HP prices, the time of the return of investment, etc., etc. The point is that we're stuck in this phase of presenting the potential of these new value chains, but we have found no project promoter because there is no really sound market for this P3HP for cosmetic applications. So the point is why, as an investor, why should I invest, give you 25 million euros to build a production plant if there is no market for 300 tons per year of P3HP? So I think that this is more or less the situation of other bioplastic solutions that are being upscaled nowadays, is that for some niche application, the market is not that sound. And this is why it's difficult to rely only on private funds, on private capital, sorry, to really create this value chain. In the policy conference that we are organizing for next June, we will bring this issue to the Commission. And the point is that when you have niche market, you can't really rely on the private capital to create the value chain. But the point is that these solutions are already TRL 8, so there are not also like research and development funds and grants for this solution. So it's a kind of peculiar situation that like the public sector consider that it's already market ready, but the financial sector consider it's not market ready, and it's very difficult to create this value chain. So this is all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to scan the QR code, you can access the hub and check out all the material on urban circular bioeconomy that we have for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And now let me share my screen. Okay, and our next speaker is Professor Bronwyn Laycock. Professor Laycock has a diverse background in polymer research with a focus on polymer biodegradation and lifetime estimation, biopolymer production, polymer functionalization, and conversion chemistries, as well as in diverse polymer applications, such as in control release and composite materials. And Professor Laycock will be talking about exploring microplastics end-of-life processes and the role of suitable substitutes in tackling pollution. Go ahead, Professor Laycock.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. It is much appreciated. So before I get onto the particular topic of microplastics, I would like to briefly introduce the centre. So we have a new centre that started last year, the ARC Training Centre for Bioplastics and Biocomposites, which has some 19 PhD students and 6 postdocs. And we're working across a wide range. We're working across the value chain, including with social scientists and so on. So we have things like a large paper that we did with our partners Cause Westgarth Chambers, a legal firm, one of the best in Australia, around labelling and policies in the Australian context, which is on our website. We just completed our second round of large survey of the public in India, Philippines, the Netherlands and Australia, 4,000 people plus, on attitudes to plastics and bioplastics. And we do a lot of work on materials development, so controlled release applications, blown films, blown PHA films, composites, PHA-based block copolymers. So setting the context that we do a lot of work around bioplastics and biocomposites, I would like to focus on biodegradation and degradation in this particular talk. I've been working in this space for more than 18 years, and it is a complex one. Next slide, please. So just to set the scene, we recently submitted a paper, published a paper in Science of the Total Environment, where we tried to do a synthesis of models for estimating lifetimes and understanding the hazards associated with degradation of plastics, looking at case studies including polyethylene, polylactic acid, PHA, and also PBAT. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in this talk is that we have to understand that the mechanisms are completely different when it comes to polyolefin type materials like the polyethylenes, which operate through a degradation mechanism which is oxygen driven, versus hydrolytic depolymerization, which is what happens with the biodegradable polymers. And it's also very important to understand, and we'll be talking about this later, that you have biopolymers which are degradable by water when they're catalyzed by enzymes in the natural environment, such as PHA, versus others that need elevated temperatures and primarily biodegrade through abiotic hydrolysis, so non-enzyme driven, in the early stages until the molecular weight gets down low enough, such as polylactic acid. So setting the scene, we have been trying to understand and model and try and do a conceptual framework for how to understand what's associated with microplastics in the environment. So if we can go to the next, please. So this is just a snapshot, and just click forward. Couple, thanks. Yeah. So this is a snapshot of the oxidation mechanisms for polyolefins. And the reason I put this in just was to highlight again that this is free radical UV heat-driven depolymerization, which typically occurs at fault sites such as metal catalysts, or in order for this chain scission process, which is oxygen driven, to occur. If I could go to the next slide, please. By contrast, so I have a paper that I published in 2017, which tried to synthesize all of the mechanisms of biodegradable polymer breakdown as well as lifetime prediction for these polymers. It basically falls into two categories. You have surface erosion, which is typically the kind of mechanism by which PHA degrades, which is hydrolytic and enzyme driven. So it's just layer by layer, retains its properties until very close to the end of life, versus bulk erosion, which is typical for polylactic acid and other enzymes, which are other polymers which are primarily abiotic, where it erodes internally and hollows out, and you lose mechanical integrity much earlier. And this is a function also of form and thickness, and you end up with degradation products that go to biomass. Next slide, please. So as we click through, you can see that there's a very complex set of characteristics in the environment that will drive environmental degradation of biodegradable polymers, which makes the prediction of the biodegradation of these materials quite complex. And yet, despite all the complexity around polymer characteristics, material bulk characteristics, environmental factors, and so on, still you can synthesize the degradation down to a reasonably generic set of rate constants where you get an element of predictability, although with a wide range of uncertainty for the degradation of microplastics. Next slide, please. So we did a meta-analysis of the marine biodegradation of PHAs. Oh,
Sorry, I don't know where it ends with the animation, but is this okay now?
so what we were trying to do was collect all of the literature that did an analysis of degradation times for PHA in the marine environment. And we looked at the effect of time to completely degrade in years based on the type of form. And because of the uncertainty associated with the different environments and so on, you can at the maximum have up to 3 years, but typically much less. So if we try and do a generic degradation process, which is what we've published in our Stoughton paper, you can see that we're really looking at the difference between bulk and surface, and you could have an initial slab of macro or mesoplastic that can either be uniform degrading, just getting thinner, or have heterogeneous faults introduced by things like surface erosion or rubbing or abrasion, and then on the left, you have decrease in molecular weight internally, so much earlier failure for those materials. Next, please. And I noticed that it's one about transition states and the hazards associated with these transition states, recognizing that we have transitions between these different products, including down to soluble products, and their associated hazards for each of those. Next slide, please. That's been recognised in a number of recent papers that are doing life cycle assessment, where we do have to think about the hazards associated with socioeconomic systems as well as human health and biota for biodegradation. Next slide, please. So even with biodegradable plastics, if you have micro and nanoplastics that are long-lasting in the environment following fragmentation or depolymerization, those in turn can have the potential to cause hazard. Next slide, please. So we did model and simulate a thin film, 20 micron thin film, and this is not in a surface environment, it's a benthic environment. So this is at the bottom of the water column, and PHA is modeled based on the available literature to have very rapid turnover of the hazardous states and end in soluble end products, non-hazardous soluble end products very early on in the process for a thin film. By contrast, polylactic acid in our initial studies, which are based on very limited literature, might have much longer term lifetimes of micro and nanoplastics in the ambient environment, which might be a concern, a hazard in use. Next slide, please. And of course, polyethylene is very, very long lived in the environment. I do have other slides that cover the effect of additives and toxic additives in particular, as well as some of the other considerations. But I will, in the interest of time, just skip through to the very last slide, please. So simulated polyethylene oxidation, if you have surface erosion, you can actually have hydrolysis. The effect of interfaces and wood composites, you could have accelerated biodegradation. Next slide, please. Toxic additives are not predictable. So we looked at phenanthrene. We also looked at the plasticizer additives, dibutyl phthalate, and we actually found it accelerated the degradation of plastics, bioplastics, PHA. And I do note we've just got a paper coming out now on the potential impacts of plasticizers in bioplastics as they leach out from those bioplastics. Next slide, please. And there are community shifts in response to the leaching of the additives from those materials. Next slide, please. It's our centre, and very happy to take any feedback.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Laycock. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Julia Reitzer. Julia is the co-founder of ULU and an oceanographer with over 15 years of experience leading R&D for universities, technology companies, and foundations, including the Ocean Cleanup, the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, and the Minderoo Foundation. And I think, Julia, you wanted to share your own screen. So let me just give you that option here.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation to contribute to this important event. And today I'm going to be introducing you to Ulu, which is an Australian startup, and hopefully convincing you that seaweed-derived PHAs are a very compelling substitute to fossil plastics. At Ulu, we are producing a material that helps us tackle three big issues that we face nowadays: plastic pollution, climate change, and ocean health. On the tackling plastic pollution front, as we all know, plastic brings many benefits to society, but unfortunately is also polluting our world. It's produced with fossil fuels, it's releasing microplastics and hazardous substances during use, and is also causing the accumulation of harmful waste after disposal. To tackle this issue, Ulu has made two core design decisions very early on in our journey. The first one is to produce PHAs. PHAs are a wide range of natural materials that are truly biocompatible, yet still provide the plastic-like properties that we came to rely on as a modern society. PHAs are reusable, they are technically recyclable, but most importantly, they are compostable as well. The second core design decision that we've made was to use farm seaweed as our carbon source. This marine crop can be grown sustainably to entirely replace the fossil fuels that we currently use to make about 400 million tons of plastic. Secondly, Ulu also helps us tackle climate change. And that's because our materials are what some call climate positive. As I previously said, we use farmed seaweed rather than fossil fuels to make our materials. Importantly, when we farm in seaweed, that seaweed absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as it grows. A fraction of the carbon end up locked in marine sediments as pieces of carbon-rich seaweed break off and become buried underwater. And then there is the harvested seaweed biomass, which we can use to produce products. In the case of Ulu, we use that seaweed biomass to make alternatives to plastic as well as animal protein. And finally, as we scale, we are also helping improve the health of our oceans. We want more farmed seaweed in our world, and we want to be incentivizing that through Ulu. Seaweeds are amazing at restoring our oceans. They do not only remove carbon from our atmosphere, but they also clean up nutrient pollution, which is causing massive issues to our marine environments. Importantly, seaweed farming provides sustainable jobs to coastal communities that would otherwise rely on overfishing to survive. We've used our Ulu material to make a variety of demonstration products, including rigid products, which are made via injection molding. Here, our materials have the potential to be used in the production of a variety of things, including packaging, furniture, and car interiors. Their properties can be fine-tuned for customers, and they can be integrated into existing manufacturing infrastructure. We are proud to say that here, within the rigid product space, we are ready for customer trials. A second area that we are very excited about and making great progress alongside Deakin University is on fabrics. Our materials used for this purpose are still in development, but are showing great potential for textile production via melt spinning. This will provide us with a groundbreaking alternative to polyester textiles. Think performance fabric without the microplastics. In addition to rigid products and fabrics, Ulu Materials has also been used to produce films and rubber-like materials. And we are also keen to find the right partners to experiments in areas such as foams, coatings, and 3D printing filament applications. I'm not sure how many of you know much about PHA, so I apologize if this is too simplified. But yeah, the way that we produce PHAs are basically these PHAs are produced by microbes inside fermenters. It's like brewing beer, but we are brewing an alternative to plastic. At Ulu, our process can be divided into 5 steps. So the first one is we farm seaweed. We can produce seaweed with any kind of seaweed, include the handful of species already farmed at scale around the world. After analyzing more than 40 seaweed samples from farms in Indonesia, Philippines, China, South Africa, and Australia, we've decided to start production with a red seaweed called Gracilaria. This is farmed at scale in Indonesia, which is the world's second largest producer of seaweed after China. The second step in our process is to basically cook that seaweed. We use special enzymes to break down the seaweed carbohydrates into fermentable sugars, and then we separate the sugary liquid from the remaining seaweed material. What's very cool at this second step here is that the leftover seaweed contains more than 50% protein, and it gives us an additional valuable product for sale into feed and food markets. The third step is to ferment PHAs. We feed the seaweed sugars to special microbes capable of growing PHAs inside them as white nurdles. PHAs are their energy storage, is like their fat. Ulu's microbes grows in salt water. This makes them extra good for seaweed, which is 90% salt water, but it also reduces our risk of contamination and time for sterilization because few other microbes can grow in such salty conditions. The fourth step of our product is to extract the PHAs from inside the cells. So when our saltwater microbes are fat enough with PHA, we submerge them in fresh water, which bursts them open. This allows us to extract the PHAs from the cells. Our extraction technique is unique that it doesn't use solvents, which are often toxic, create toxic waste streams, but also can be quite expensive. Finally, we make pellets. We dry our PHA into a powder and then turn them into pellets ready for manufacture. This is done by melting the PHA with small amounts of natural ingredients that tweak their properties for different applications, including packaging and fabrics, which is the areas that we focus on at the moment. Importantly, these pellets are ready to be used with existing plastic manufacturing equipment. And now I'm just going to play a very short video that further highlights our mission here at Ulu. My name is Julia Heinsatt. I am an oceanographer by background, originally from Brazil.
My name is Michael Kingsbury. I joined Ulu after a few years of being interested in science and technology and building businesses.
So our Ulu, in a nutshell, we're basically fermenting seaweed into this natural plastic-like material. And what we're very excited about this material is that it can replace plastic while being good for the world.
My name is David Chiukarogude. So what we do in the first stage is we get seaweed, cook it. That's a simple term for hydrolysis. We break it down into simple sugars and then turn that into a soup or a media, like the biologists will say, that we would use to grow bacteria. And then we get out something called PHAs, polyhydroxyalkanoates. Those are the biodegradable plastics. And then we take this polymer bits, and then extrude them and mold them into pellets, which you can convert into anything. Anything that can be molded from plastic can be molded from our material.
The problem we're trying to solve is a planetary challenge, which is plastic pollution. Creating a material that has the potential to replace plastic at scale, whilst also using a feedstock that isn't fossil fuels, but something that is renewable, scalable, sustainable. Seaweed's an awesome feedstock, both from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. It absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide from the environment, and it also absorbs marine pollutants. So things like fertilizers and industrial runoff that enter our waterways and oceans. So it's a great marine crop that we really want to scale up more of, and then we're incentivizing that through all of it.
I am super positive about the future. I think humanity can move very quickly in terms of change. Can't wait to create the better future and be working hard to help create that.
Julia, can we ask you to stop the video? We have seen the okay, it's the end. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. For the interest of time, we have to move on and appreciate it. Okay. So our next speaker is Dr. Miriam Weber. She's a marine biologist and the director of Hydra Marine Sciences. Miriam, if you would like to share your screen, just let me know and I will stop the sharing.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to share my screen. Ready to go.
Okay.
Thank you. So today I gladly present the potential of biodegradable material in the environment and how to evaluate it, work we have been doing for the past 15 years. Let's talk first about the motivation. We have numerous applications where we have input to the environment, as here in the example from a wet wipe, like little fibers moving into soil, fresh water, or the marine environment. And not long time ago, we have the EU policy framework, which needs published, which needs contributions for its implementation. And we also want to prepare for upcoming policy, and certainly also with this contribution support UN Plastic Treaty. So the European Commission sought out help from the science advice for policy by European academies some time ago, and a group of 14 experts have then been working on this document, and we extracted 3 main categories I briefly want to introduce here. We do have intentional release into the environment where recovery is not foreseen or impossible, like shown here in the pictures, examples of geotextiles supporting our coastlines or any kind of construction sites, for example. The second category we identified is that we do have applications with high potential of loss to the environment. Recovery often impossible or also not foreseen. Here, like during the pandemic, facial masks came up in a much more volume. Here you see some examples from our studies looking at different types of facial masks. And also another example here is fish attracting devices. The list of these kind of applications we lose to the environment with high potential of risk of loss is long. These are just 2 of examples. The third category is that we have an unavoidable release to the environment and recovery is impossible. This is mainly done by abrasion from any kind of objects we are using in our everyday life. Here, because it's also related to the topic ocean, I chose 2 examples from near the ocean, like fibers from ropes, they're shedded off, or particles from feeding pipes, they're losing weight in an astonishingly fast time. We should then consider to substitute with biodegradable material. Other examples are certainly paint. Yeah, why do we have to paint our streets now and then, or houses and so on? We do have applications we put down the drain, yeah, not a few, there are many. And we do also have residuals from compost or anaerobic digestion plants. We put them out in our agricultural fields. There we have some transition between compartments. The group also identified 3 time frames we should consider because the environment is complex, as already pictured by the previous speakers, and so we cannot say it has to be biodegraded within like 28 days or something like that. So we identified time frames like fast, medium, or slow, or translate that in weeks to months, months to years, or years to decades, always related also to the application and the needed lifetime of the corresponding product. This work then fueled into the policy framework published around about 1.5 years ago. And it is a communication to the Commission, from the Commission to the European Parliament, the Council, European Economic and other groups working on this topic. And here I briefly extract the main topics concerning biodegradable plastics with the focus on the open environment. It says that policy should give direction on the use of biodegradable and compostable plastics based on the assessment of the application where this use is beneficial to the environment. So the big question raises now, what is beneficial? It has been already touched. It is the case that biodegradable plastics are not likely to persist and accumulate, provided that they fully compose. So in contrast to persistent plastics, which will accumulate, we have a decrease in pollution, and this is considered as a benefit. Plastic claimed as biodegradable should be based on existing standards and certification schemes, and they should then also specify the receiving environment and the required time frame in terms of weeks, months, and years, and also, as previously touched already, that the environment impact is minimal. So this gives us now quite a big range of what we should look at, and that's how we do it in a structured way. We first look at what are the receiving environments, then we check, is the material biodegradable? Then how long does it actually take to biodegrade? What are the impacts, and which standards and certification schemes are in place or which should then still be developed? This is quite a delicate balance because you can test basically everything everywhere, but this takes a long time. So you either be at the edge of low environmental relevance or high uncertainty, or you use a lot of time and costs, which from my perspective is also a problem because we can see being outside in the environment, working there, that the accumulation is growing fast. So we need a careful selection and assessment. This brings me to the mind map of our testing scheme. I run you through how to actually show the reduction of pollution. We first do testing in controlled environments where we can test repeat, and we have a rather artificial environment, but we can show the full decomposition by assessing the final products of remineralization. To then actually also understand the biodegradation time frame, actually to assess how long does it take, we do testing then in controlled mesocosms or even field tests. We do also consider transit between compartments, so testing in compost and then soil, or from soil a mulch film is washed into a freshwater creek nearby. Or in the marine environment, we then extract the main compartments where products can end up. Here in this case, for example, the seafloor, a beach, and a water column when a product is floating. And we do then assess with the assessed data, do statistical modeling. So we can predict the half-life, which is then an option to numerically compare the different environmental scenarios. Here in this graph, you see a violin plot with the numbers in the boxes, giving you a half-life and a tropical seafloor for this PHB film of 85 microns. Thickness was about 2 months. In the Mediterranean seafloor was about 2 years, and in a beach scenario in the Mediterranean, 1.5 years. To add on more scenarios, here's some data from a mesocosm test. We added an open water column scenario, a beach scenario with different environmental settings, so a bit cooler, different inundations, and so on. You see here then around about 4.5 years. To sum up, this gives us a time frame in the marine environment in these particular settings from months to years. Done this, we then continue with assessing the minimal harm on organism and ecosystem level. And with all these data, we have enough to report then in a certification process, because we can report the receiving environments, timeframes, and minimal harm. All that together brings us to the summary that we do have input to the environment, although we have all measures done. Let's say we have done all our homework in reducing leakage and substituting with having less abrasion and so on. We still have intentional release. We still have high potential of loss, and we still have unavoidable release by abrasion. So for that, we think that taking nature as a ally is a very smart idea, so we can deal with these numerous inputs and use biodegradable materials, proven that they biodegrade and so reduce the pollution. We do have the testing scheme delivering the needed data for certification ready, and it's also ready for its implementation. With that, I'd like to thank for the opportunity to share here our testing scheme and how we do that, and thank all the collaborators supporting this work in the last years, and hope to make new contacts and exchange here to actually further improve and then implement also for the UN Plastic Treaty, or then on other levels needed. Thank you so much. And looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. We have one more speaker or presenter, but before that, I just have a quick housekeeping announcement. We are running a little bit behind schedule. Thanks to all the great presenters, and this is really very interesting and impressive group of presenters. So we would request the presenters to stay on a little longer, if this would be okay, for up to 30 minutes. We think that we wanted to keep at least 30 minutes of time for Q&A session. And the same for the attendees. If you can bear with us and continue to stay on, this would be great. Thank you. I will now reshare my screen. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Dr. Linda Amarell-Zettler. She is a research leader at the NIOS Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research in North Holland, and holds a professional chair in marine biology at the University of Amsterdam. And I think, Linda, you wanted to share your own screen.
Yes, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
And I will start.
I will go ahead and do that. Okay. Right. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and talk about plastic pollution and the plastosphere. Does polymer type really matter? Oops. Okay. So we've already heard about plastic pollution, and really it's considered in the marine environment and elsewhere a planetary boundary threat. And that's because plastic pollution is a global problem with irreversible exposure and unknown disruptive impacts on planetary processes. And so we have an opportunity through the Global Plastics Treaty to really think about transitioning away from fossil fuel-based materials. And in a landmark first writing of the COP28, there has been a call for reduction of use and reliance on fossil fuels. And this is important because fossil fuel-based plastic is responsible for 3% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So as we know, we are living in a plastic world, in effect. Shortly after World War II, plastic use and accumulation has taken off to over 400 million metric tons per year, greater actually than the weight of all humans on Earth. And this dramatic increase is largely a result of our culture, which was highlighted in the cover of Life magazine in 1950 of a throwaway living society. And we have an opportunity now to think about alternatives. And so biodegradable plastics are only 1% of the market, but they are projected to triple in the next 5 years. And if this trend continues, what we'll see is the trend that you're seeing here. But the term bioplastics as a solution, or too good to be true, is something we really have to reflect on. And the reason for that is because bioplastics is a term that's used for things that are both bio-based and non-biodegradable, such as bio-PET. But more importantly, in this green zone here, bio-based and biodegradable, and polyhydroxyalkanoates are an excellent example of such. And on the arrow that you see is just the range of marine biodegradability that has been tested. Somewhere in the middle is polylactic acid, and I think the question of its biodegradability is somewhat still at large in thinking about potential blending of polylactic acid with other types of natural products, which we have been discussing during this session. So a bioplastic solution, why is it necessary? Well, as Miriam has just described, there are unavoidable release of certain materials into the environment based on various activities, economic and otherwise. So what about plastic removal technologies? Well, we have heard about open ocean solutions such as the ocean cleanup and using materials to collect material in the plastic material in the Great Atlantic or Great garbage patches of the world, and coastal solutions that involve cleaning up rivers like the Mr. Trash Wheel, and even in Amsterdam here in the Netherlands, the Great Bubble Barriers as urban solutions. And while these efforts have some effect, particularly in coastal areas and riverine systems, we have to think about their impacts on the life that gets collected at the same time. And there are some commentaries on this recently in the Atlantic, and also a recent commentary in One Earth by colleagues really thinking about, okay, is this where we need to be expending our efforts in cleaning up the ocean? So where does it go, and why is this important? Well, a lot of the efforts to clean up plastic involve plastic that is currently involved with plastic marine debris, which is plastic that floats. And these are the conventional fossil fuel-based plastics. But even fossil fuel-based plastics ultimately end up sinking and ultimately on the seafloor. And that's really not a sustainable way to clean up the ocean. And these are striking images of some of the remotest coral reefs. And you can see that plastic marine debris in the form of ghost nets have populated these remote areas. So density of plastic is important to think about. The biodegradable alternatives are largely sinking varieties shown below the wave line, but even fossil fuel-based plastics will ultimately sink when they become biofouled. And just to reiterate, cleaning up the ocean, especially in the small scale when we're dealing with microplastics and nanoplastics, is extremely difficult to study scientifically, but even effectively non-sustainable in terms of trying to clean up on a on a level of macroplastic. And these are just some of the methods we use just to study microplastics, and nanoplastics is even more challenging. So this brings us to the plastosphere. And if you do a wiki search on the definition of plastosphere, it's been described as ecosystems that have evolved to live in human-made plastic environments. When me as a microbial ecologist and oceanographer started thinking about the plastosphere, we considered it this thin film of life that develops on plastic. So there is no virgin plastic in the ocean. It is colonized by microbes. They have their own life, if you will, their own little world where there are organisms that photosynthesize, there are organisms that eat other organisms, and there are even organisms that potentially use some of the leachates in fossil fuel-based plastics as a food source. So the concept of the plastosphere sort of extends beyond science and education and policy and industry as we try to better understand how perhaps microbes can help solve the plastic pollution problem, particularly in the oceans. And we care about this because plastic is a form of pollution, and at least floating plastics can transport harmful algal blooming species. They can transport disease-causing organisms, and also they can displace native species such as ghost nets that can actually be the home for endemic species of some seaweed species that naturally occur in the open waters. So when we ask if microbes can biodegrade plastic in the ocean, we shouldn't only be thinking about whether they can break them down into smaller fragments, but all the way down into the essential elements that other organisms can use, CO2 and or methane, water, and cell biomass. So when we think about microbial-mediated biodegradation, my group, we're very interested in who does it, where they do it, and how they're effectively functioning. But we also want to think of how quickly this happens. And of course, we've just heard about different ways of sort of thinking about that. I want to emphasize that even in our best efforts, the marine environment is not homogeneous. It is very diverse in terms of temperature and pressure, and also the presence of microbial activity. So we have to think about all these things in terms of how we might in fact beat plastic pollution, to better understand how we can work with standards to understand recycling and recovery of plastic waste, but also biodegradation testing that ultimately does justice to the kind of environmental end life that some of these existing plastics, but also newer plastics that are coming online will experience. So with that, I want to skip over to my take-home messages and emphasize that there is really one ocean. It's all connected and it's shared by all of us. And litter does not respect EEZs, exclusive economic zones. Marine environments are not homogeneous, and certainly out of sight shouldn't be out of mind when we think about biodegradation. I think the mantra reduce, reuse, recycle is still important. I know there have been more repurposing and various alternations of this particular mantra, but I think we still need to pay attention to this. And certainly biodegradable plastics should be part of the solution. But ultimately, proper waste infrastructure and composting facilities are really required to make this a complete full circle effort. And a last thought is that global problems require global cooperation, including across international standardization bodies. And my last take-home message is, what does the future hold? Is it a plastic ocean or vibrant and healthy seas? Really, this is the time, and the decision is now in our hands. So thank you for that.
Excellent presentation by everybody. Again, thank you very much to our panelists. We have a few questions from the audience. I would like to let me look at them and see if I could quickly frame them. So first question is for Kanika and for Erwin. Is Kanika PHA or other products made from cooking oil? And if so, can it still be called sustainable? Or is it still part of the sustainable? You can still call it sustainable.
I do not very well understand the full question of the reasoning behind. So indeed, I would say if you use a recycled biomass, that would at least be a part of a sustainable solution as well, to make to make plastic materials. Again, I think sustainability is, of course, as well. So, to what are you looking at if you claim it's sustainable? I think, of course, if you use recycled cooking oil, you will have a lower LCA as well than compared to using virgin plant oils. So I would say yes, using recycled cooking oil is sustainable or part of a sustainable solution.
Well, of course, I mean, whether you use, as long as you're using renewable carbon, that is an important aspect. So therefore, sustainability, yes, definitely. You can call PHAs that are made from food carbon also sustainable, being that they are made from renewable carbon. But as you said, that if they are, of course, coming from waste carbon, then the sustainability profile improves or increases, but nonetheless, it's still sustainable. Okay, I have, let's see, I have a question for Enrique and maybe for Mahesh together in the area of, you presented drafts on what are alternatives and what are substitutes. If I look at the definition, if we look at the definition, what we see is that there are, of course, subtle differences between them. So, I mean, from that aspect, what do you feel, how do you think that we can be, like, for example, do we need to be more, do we need to separate those two areas more from a trade, industry, or WTO perspective, or should we be really focused on the attributes rather than putting labels like substitutes and alternatives?
Can I start, Mahesh? So just a quick reaction to that. Defining different clusters is a way to organize thoughts, right? And of course, there are substitutes that are undesired and alternatives that could be desired. And again, there are products that can transit, depending on how you see it, physically from one category to another. What you just give the answer. What is the most important aspect is the performance of the product, especially as the plastics are highly traded. Plastic substitutes and alternatives are highly traded. Plastic is $1.2 trillion and traded from and to countries where you have a low environmental governance capabilities. So having things that only work in very structured places might not work. You still need to keep the barrier function. Right? Nothing replaces the barrier function to keep food safety, hygiene, and other things. So you need both kind of a spectrum of materials, but ideally, and that's what we hope from the INC process, that there will be some kind of action that will separate a bit where materials can go based on also on the destination where they're being exported to, if they can handle specific materials or not. So to make it short, the environmental performance is the key. And by the way, we also plan to refresh that definition of space between alternatives and substitutes, also because PHA fits within cellulosic derivatives. So to be seen. We're going to update that because it's a very quick evolving sector. Mahesh.
Thank you, Enrique. Yes, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, the environmental impacts differ greatly. And I think one of the key things that we also see in the market is that there's a lot of greenwashing that is happening. I mean, some products which are labeled as recyclable, biodegradable. There's certain products, I mean, bioplastics, for example, which would need very specific or specialized industrial composting facilities, which are not available in a number of countries. So in terms of how they are managed and in terms of policies that apply to them, I think that would definitely vary. So in terms of promotional policies, for example, I guess the question would be whether the same set of promotional policies should apply to some substitutes, which have lower, less friendly, environmentally friendly characteristics, for example, like a lot of alternative plastics. So that is definitely, I think that distinction certainly has to be made in the policy discourse.
Mahesh, in that one slide where you showed all the different, a lot of examples of what could be substitutes and what could be alternatives, did not see PHA mentioned. I'm just kind of curious, where do you classify it? at the moment?
Yeah, so the list that I showed in the slide, I mean, that's essentially the list that was compiled by the WTO Secretariat. And the list actually came out of the trade policy, the reviews of various trade policy measures that were prevailing in different countries around the world. So, and it's still an evolving list. So basically, based on the ministerial statement clearly says that, it's not an exhaustive list, it's evolving, and there are more products that can potentially be added to it. So obviously, I think the space is quite open, but it's just that probably that PHA did not, sort of was not mentioned as, by any of the members so far, and that's why it wasn't listed. That's possible. And if there are examples, I mean, there obviously, there could be definitely included in the future. So that list, the appendix is going to be evolving. And perhaps by the next ministerial conference, you would have a lot more products in those two categories that will be added based on further surveys or further reviews of the policies.
And if we were to try and influence that, how would we go about doing that? I mean, could we petition the WTO to put PHA on for example, on the substitute list?
Yes, I mean, I guess one route would obviously be to approach, member states in terms of, through the trade ministries, the trade delegations that are active in Geneva at the WTO, so sort of approaching them, via private sector organizations or industry associations. The other example, which already is working very successfully, is that the DPP process relies a lot also on stakeholder inputs. So there are a lot of stakeholders that do participate in the DPP proceedings. I mean, they make presentations. There are also different associations and organizations that are invited, external organizations that are invited to make presentations at specific DPP sessions. So that could also be a way of contributing input into the process.
Okay, thank you. So for both of you, one more, because since the treaty negotiations are ongoing, this is a hot topic, looks like, for questions. So there is one more question for either or both of you, and that is, what are the next steps that you envision in the UN treaty process to try and stimulate this use of substitutes and alternatives, and how are those routes being, those routes being informed to the stakeholders, for example? I mean, what would be the process like?
Should I start?
Sure, please, Mahesh.
Okay, great. So, I mean, the INC process also has a lot of stakeholders that are participating, and as far as I know, there's lots of civil society organizations, research institutions, think tanks, private sector. I mean, I'm not following all of those processes very closely. I do know that plastic substitutes, that the importance has been mentioned in a number of member submissions as well as stakeholder submissions, and also, as we've seen from the example on financing of non-plastic substitutes has come up in the INC context. But I think it would be interesting, I guess, for stakeholders perhaps to really bring their contribution on what are the important elements to keep in mind in terms of an ecosystem where these non-plastic substitutes can thrive, making sure that the important elements are not missed, whether it's definitions, whether it's standards, whether it's lack of support, or need for financing, funding, markets, consumer behavior. There's a lot of different things in there. So really, I think that participating in the INC process through stakeholders that are already there, or maybe looking at opportunities where we can, you could provide some inputs, for example, through governments, through environment ministries, for example, that could also be a route to explore as well.
Complementing what Mahesh just said, and I've seen industry groups influencing in a technical way policy processes, such as the European Photovoltaic Industry Association, who provides data on photovoltaics deployment to the European Commission, Biofuels Association, who provides that type of similar data to other bodies. So it's important that you feed into the member states, as Mahesh suggested, that type of information, because they have ultimately the pen in the treaty, and also work on perhaps at the lower level because this confusion and complexities on biodegradables and better plastics, so to say, or non-plastics, is not something that happens only at the macro level or the treaty level or at the WTO, but also at the regions. For example, we plan to organize a series of events on biodegradables and compostables regulation to assist countries in West and East Africa on how to put that into law, because they struggle so far on how to regulate what kind of materials can enter their market, especially the biodegradable ones. So help us with that, participating together with the standard bodies and the environment management agencies of countries. I think it will be the important team to build ideas and model laws that could potentially be adopted by countries. And finally, on communication, you mentioned, I think labeling is essential. Avoiding misrepresentation. We are launching a study on that. I think people should know what a product contains, if a certain cup or something contains plastics embedded in it, which kind of plastics, if it degrades or not. So that's a front of work, the labeling one, following the energy efficiency, nutritional labelings that were developed through time, I think is also essential because the consumer can engage by better choice.
Thank you, Mahesh and Enrique. Okay. So let's see. Elisa, you mentioned in one of your slides that we're kind of stuck here. No sound market, no sound investments. Of course, fully understood. But if I look at what other PHA producers are doing, like for example, Kaneka presented various applications, and also with Ulu. Where do you see this is a very interesting concept because I know that Italy is doing quite a bit in terms of organic composting and this kind of recycling of waste materials. Where do you see the material, the market for your materials?
Thank you very much for this question, India. So basically, we must be careful when we think of P3HB or PHAs in general as material for packaging or let's say other hard items, or when we think in the microparticle of PHAs to be used as functional ingredient. So in the first case, we must consider the compostability of the material, because as I've listened from other presentations, we must harmonize the waste management system to allow this compostability to actually happen, because in most composting facilities, the length and the temperature of the process is not enough to currently to actually degrade most PHAs or even polylactic acid, etc. In the case of the value chain that we are trying to create in Italy, it's slightly different, because the material, the P3HB microparticles that are extracted directly from the cells, are included as functional ingredient in the product. So here, the problem is not about how to degrade, let's say, the packaging of the object. It's just about what happens to these microplastic that go to the environment. So one of the advantages of P3HB is that this microplastic is totally biodegradable in a relatively short time frame, and they are completely atoxic. So when it comes to the market, I think that what really happens is that even if it's evident that P3HB and PHAs have a lot of application and they are very beneficial for the environment, if there is not a market demand, and it's the case with Italy, there is a will, there is awareness, but there are no specific markets. So if there is no specific market, there is no way to move forward. Maybe this the cases that my panelist colleagues have exposed. Maybe they are kind of older value chains that have already a very established market. So this is why we can think and talk about these successful business cases. But I think that maybe in the early stages of their project, they also experience this stack that we are seeing in the Italian case.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I have a question for Professor Laycock. You mentioned microplastics generation, and with respect to PHA, you also indicated, or at least one of your slides seemed to indicate, that PHAs or PLAs or other biodegradable materials do create microplastics. But of course, what I would like to understand is a little bit this idea of microplastic itself in the biodegradation of PHA or other biodegradable materials, because you mentioned that some of them could also be harmful, or maybe I did not hear that right. Can you, yeah.
So what I was saying is that all plastics undergo transition states. So if you have a plastic material, a plastic product, it undergoes a series of processes which can include fragmentation. It can also include just conversion, depolymerization at the surface to chemical products like VFAs or so on in the case of PHAs. But at some point, these plastic products do break apart. At a certain thinness, even PHA will fragment because it shifts across to bulk erosion when it gets very, very thin. So it won't always go straight to a soluble product. So when we're thinking about any plastic, whether it's non-degradables or biodegradables, there is a natural progression. It does get into smaller particles, and we actually do not understand the hazards associated with those transition states. This is very, it has not been well researched. But the fact is that we just have to be aware that while a plastic, whether it's biodegradable or not, is in the environment, it could represent a hazard through intake, through just having the same kinds of hazards that any plastic particle could have, ingestion, whatever. And this is still very early days. The shorter it's in the environment,
I think what's it called? Froze.
Regardless
yes.
of the plastic type.
Yes, go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah, I would like to echo that any input to the environment is pollution, and we should consider this. And the question is of minimal harm. Yeah, that how to define this, and also to direct research in what direction we have knowledge gaps, and we should fill them so that we can come up with a sound implementation on a legislation level. We also can copy that from many other inputs we have into the environment. Yeah, we do not have to learn from scratch. So it's not a topic which is very scary, I would say. It's a topic to address and to implement in the ongoing discussion and implementation of policy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. I have a question for Linda. You mentioned standards, certifications as being critical here. And I know that in the past you have worked on and are quite active in the standards generation bodies. And do you think that we have sufficient standards to really form these legislations? Because if you see what happened in the SUP directive, that using labels, and this is why I use the term labeling, using the label of natural polymers, certain materials got excluded, and it took on a different form. But do you think that there are enough standards out there already that we can potentially effectively use them to regulate plastics or alternatives or substitutes that can function appropriately in our commercial uses?
Yeah. Well, I can say that indeed, having been in the standards space for almost 10 years now in terms of being involved with ASTM and more recently with ISO, that there has definitely been development of additional standards to try to accommodate, at least I can speak for the marine environment, a diversity of more and different types of marine environments. But this question of being able to predict lifetimes is still a very active one for the standards community. And I do think that people need to come together and really work together towards also putting the science behind ground truthing some of these approaches. But it's an evolution process, and we have to allow standards to have a chance, if you will, in terms of testing and use. And you know, it's a voluntary process too, right? So we have to think about really, I guess, developing a culture of adopting standards and following them and adhering to them. I think that's part of the challenge too, is really having people adopt them in meaningful ways and make them work for us.
Yes, go ahead, Miriam.
In terms of standards, we also have the issue that we have applications with different lifetimes, and the standards as such develop from the composting history, let's say, where we have very controlled conditions and very short lifetimes. So we have to adapt the current standard situation also to many, many other applications I was trying to highlight in my presentation. Also for applications where we have long lifetimes needed. Yeah, and still in the environment. So there's some challenges to overcome, but I think life is complex, so we will also find some good solutions for that.
Yeah, actually, on that note, Miriam, I mean, you know, you mentioned SAPIA, and you mentioned that they have been already, the Commission has been looking at this space for quite some time. It's not like that they haven't had any feedback or anything like that from their own science bodies. But why is there still proper legislation lacking in this area? What is your thought? Or I can open the question up to others as well. I mean, if you would like to chime in.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. With the work with the commissioners, I learned that the topic is not so easy to solve because it implements and it impacts many other aspects of the implementation of the Green Deal in terms of Europe or the European Union. And on the other case, they echo back that if they put mandatory biodegradable materials for certain applications, they will influence an industrial sector very, very heavily. So before doing that, they really ask us scientists and industry for sound case studies that they can be sure that if they ask for a mandatory application to be biodegradable being mandatory, let's say that way, not creating other big problems or making prices too high that the EU is not compatible anymore and so on. So this is the complexity behind it, and that's why policy is going slow. And therefore, I can just call out industry and researchers and everyone supporting these works to give a push also in this direction, then policy can move on faster.
Yeah, Arvin, sorry, anybody else? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to make one quick comment also, which is that there is
And we keep losing Bronwyn.
testing, and the complexity gets much harder in terms of materials like PBAT, which behave very differently under those conditions than they would under aerobic. So it's a complex space.
Yeah, Erwin, any thoughts, ideas, any other, you know, you are involved a lot in this space, in the legislative policy space. Why do you see even the Commission trying to have positive lists and things like that? I mean, Miriam, you mentioned they are afraid to promote one material versus over another, but why do they create positive lists? Why is it necessary? Why is that not left to free market? You know, so either you, Erwin, and also you, Miriam, and others can chime in as well.
Yeah, for me, it's difficult to comment. I think Miriam already commented partly that seemingly the Commission is still confused about the opportunity these type of materials can bring, and maybe a little bit afraid about the negative aspect in other stages. I think if you look to indeed the single-use plastic directive, where they indeed start to banning conventional plastics, they already make reference that maybe marine biodegradability could be an alternative for that. But unfortunately, we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it yet. So I think for us, I think it's all basically an aspect of making clear definitions and clear standards, and not keeping any gray zone, which happens now. You see, for example, on the discussion again in the single-use plastic directive of natural polymer, it's not clearly defined yet. So here as well, the Commission supports a really cellulose-based industry. And it's, for us, it's disappointing that indeed they do not look any further yet. And again, as here as well with standards, I think for me it's key important that standards related to marine biodegradability would be more worked out even at Commission level or at SEN standards, to have it really be usable in legislations.
I see the aspect that they have a clear structure to follow, yeah, that they want to be clear that there is reduction in place, that there is recycling in place, that there is clear way also how to use composting, and to integrate all that is not the easiest way. So I think we have one good example, which I call the icebreaker. It's fertilizer coating, which was put on mandatory to become biodegradable or only be used by biodegradable materials in 2026. Industry has now the time to convert their products. And based on this example, there will be more application-based implementations and policy follow, provided that there are case studies showing this clear benefit by the substitution to make mandatory.
Maybe if I may, Miriam, to add to that, I think we have a second one, which is, of course, the intentionally added microplastics, where indeed the Commission already gives some criteria for biodegradability as substitute to fossil or synthetic plastics and microplastics.
Okay, thank you for that. If any of you have questions for each other, of course, you're free to ask them as well, but I know that that may not always be easy. Anybody has any questions for any of the other panelists? Panelists have questions for other panelists? Okay, then here's another one. So there has been some discussions and talks and also some language in the UN treaty on an expert body to try and regulate some of these. Is there, I mean, do you see, Mahesh and Henrique, do you see any movement in this area? And what might be, you know, what is needed, or who might be who might be choosing that body, you know, or who would be on that body, for example?
I think I would defer to Henrique. I mean, I've been, not very plugged into that process on the scientific.
There have been calls for the establishment of intersessional meetings or a technical panel, a scientific panel, to define sustainability criteria or specific criteria for acceptability or not of specific materials. As I understand, this has not been taken forward, at least not yet, by member states, perhaps because of the risks of losing control of what the definitions would be. I think that's an important question for member states. If they want to delegate that to a scientific body, if they want to agree on a definition among themselves using their national supports. So there is a last chance now between INC-4 and INC-5 in South Korea, where such definitions could be struck. Is a bit late, I think. Perhaps if they extend the process, but so far it's in a limbo. We don't know if there will be intersessional meetings on definitions production by kind of set of scientists or appointed individuals.
And do you see that the treaty is on time, or is it going to be beyond INC-5, you think?
I would direct that question to the INC Secretariat.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Okay. Let's see. Okay. One more question for Bronwyn. You also, you showed the free radical degradation, based degradation of polyethylene. Now, of course, so there's chain scission happening, so you get down to oligomers and then eventually probably to monomers. Now, how is there anything in literature that describes, or in your own research that you have seen, where you can actually describe the hazards or potential toxicity of these kind of oligomeric fossil polymers or their monomers, for example? Is there anything you can talk about that?
Most of the toxicity associated with polyethylenes and other commodity plastics tends to be associated with the additives, not so much the polymer itself. When it's oxidizing, it basically goes through degrading down to waxes and really oxidized waxy materials. I have not seen anything, and I may have missed it, but I have not seen anything that indicates that those oxidized waxes themselves are particularly a problem, although of course they can coat and they can absorb hydrophobic materials and bioaccumulate and so on. So that there's a lot of sort of secondary effects, but oxidized waxes per se are not necessarily hazardous.
There are also some polymers. For example, I know of polyvinyl alcohol, which is actually a soluble in water, and it is used extensively in textiles, for example. Is there anything with polymers, fossil polymers that are soluble in water, for example, that is known to be toxic as well,
So this is actually getting outside my particular area of expertise. So I haven't been tracking sort of commodity plastic toxicity, soluble plastic toxicity. I'm more focused on biodegradable polymers. So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, are there, yeah, I had one other question for Kanika or for anyone who's making PHA. Is there a HS code that you are using at the moment that you can share? Because I think that you have shown some HS codes, Mahesh and Enrique. I think from a trade-related perspective, this is an interesting topic. That could there be new codes created for PHA? What is the process like? I mean, because this might be, this is a great angle to try and promote PHA via, trade or trade-related instruments. And could there be a new HS code created for or necessary for PHA, for example?
Well, if I may react on that, I don't see the need to create a new code. I think the two codes are there. The code for natural polyhydroxyalkanoates, and I think you have the code for synthetic polyhydroxyalkanoates. So I think the differentiation has been made, and I think is very clear. And of course, if your process is based on natural PHA, I mean, fermentation process, I think the natural code can be used.
Yes, I mean, sorry, Anindya, just to intervene there for Erwin. I mean, there are those two codes that exist that you mentioned, but is there, I mean, it also includes a lot of other polymers, right? So it would include a lot of other materials under the alginic acid category, which in addition to PHA. So would there be some sort, at least from a commercial perspective, to differentiate the PHA from some of those other ones and have their own code? I mean, maybe there's no need for a distinct code. Maybe it could be, trade could very well happen, but would you see a value in having something very specific to PHA, like either it's synthetic or natural?
Well, I mean, I don't know if there is a I don't know if there is really from an end of life perspective or from a functionality standpoint, because the PHA itself, after it has been produced, has no memory of where it came from. So it does not remember anymore whether it was a synthetic or whether it was a natural material.
Right.
So there is really no after it has been made, unless you can track down from let's say the radioactivity of the carbon side, to do carbon dating as to whether it came from a fossil carbon or from a natural carbon, from a biogenic carbon. Besides that, there would be really no difference that you could potentially have, in theory, I'm talking about. So if that's the case, then I understand that there may not be a need for even two separate HS codes. But okay, if it does exist, I was thinking that maybe more, as there are more and more, because PHA is not one material. It has, in theory, you could have, innumerable, I mean, countless number of combinations. There are something like 150 different monomers that have been discovered so far. And if you talk about even the 4 or 5 that are commercial today, the comonomers, the copolymers, you can have literally, hundreds of different combinations already. If that's the case, then what is going to drive that from a trade perspective? That was sort of the reason for the question originally. So, okay. We have completed the 30 minutes or 35 minutes, something like that, of Q&A. Is there any other last burning questions that anybody has or would like to ask? Otherwise, we would like to thank the panelists again. Thank you again very much for your great presentations. And we would like to then end the webinar over here right now.